Okay, good morning, ladies. Looks like all ladies. I think, anyway, so good morning. I got to watch not to lean, be careful not to lean on my desk this morning. Um, my computer's not quite stable. So, for lack of a, for lack of not having taken a lot of time to think about this morning and running late and all kinds of other things, I thought a couple of weeks ago, Estella asked about the elk rack behind me and asked about the story about that. And I've never really talked about it. I realize that I'm talking to a bunch of women, and I don't know how you all feel about hunting. So I'm not going to tell a hunting story. But I'm going to tell you about that elk rack. And actually, what I want to talk about is heaven, actually, believe it or not, in truth. I'm not making fun. But oh my. Okay, well, I'm not sure if you can all read the quotes, but we'll want to pray for Ray Wagner then before we're done. So the story of the elk rack. This story actually started quite a few years ago. I have a friend, my mom will know this guy, a guy named Barry Rebert, who is a pastor, probably slightly younger than my mom and dad. But he served in Allentown at the same time that they did for a few years. He kind of became I think I became a surrogate kid for him. He didn't have any boys, had girls, and used to take me fishing and hunting a lot. Great guy, he's now retired. But quite a few years ago, he invited me up to his house. He lived in Mones Hill at the time. I was living in Adamstown. Adamstown was at the base of the hill. Mones Hill was up at the top. And he asked me to come on up, and he wanted to show me something. And I walked into his house, and he had an elk, actually a shoulder mount. He had an elk in his house. It took up really, those elk are huge. They're like horses with antlers. So it was sticking off of his wall, took up his whole living room. And he had gone on an elk hunt in Colorado. And he simply wanted to show me and tell me the story. And I think Pat, his wife's name is Bev. For those of you who are looking, we'll pray for Ray Wagner when we're done. Ray and Bev Wagner are neighbors to my mom. Looks like he had a pretty serious issue last night, so we will pray for them when we're done. Anyway, so Barry wanted to show me, he wanted to tell me the story of his elk hunt. I was a pretty young pastor at the time, and I grew up in a pastor's home. So I knew and I know the pastor's life very well. And that elk hunt that Barry Rebert went on was, some of it came as a gift to him from his church at the time. And I remember looking at that elk, and I love hunting, as you know. I love being outside. Never been out west at that time. And I remember thinking, I will never do that. That's just beyond my means, beyond the pastoral life. It's something that I will never have an opportunity to do. And I honestly can say I was sad about that. It was just reality. For me, it was just simply reality. Also realized I forgot to plug in my mic. So sound is probably terrible again, like it was yesterday. Sorry about that. Anyway, so I just looked at that as reality. It was just part of my calling that I would never get to do that. Fast forward a lot of years, my daughter Erin was dating a guy named Dan Martin, a guy she ultimately married. Dan had spent some time out west working at a ranch, but he was now back in PA, and he was working on his family dairy farm out in Perry County. And Erin was dating Dan, And Dan was here. He was in visiting one time in Allentown. And Hope Church, where my dad was pastor, they were doing their annual sportsman's banquet in February. Dan happened to be home, so he went along to that sportsman's banquet with me. And we sat next to a guy named Phil Yetter, a good friend who also comes to Horizon. They live up in Etters, up near Stroudsburg, PA, and will sometimes drive down to Horizon once or twice a month. So Dan and Phil and I were sitting at the sportsman's banquet, and we got talking about elk hunting, something Dan has done several times. And at that sportsman's banquet, I was asking Dan, how do you do this? What's involved in elk hunting? And I'm kind of embarrassed to say that to, Rox, your son-in-law, Phil, if you're an out-of-state resident, to get an elk license in Wyoming, the cost is about $700. That just kind of blew me away. And it reminded me again why I thought that's something that I will never do. But the three of us were talking, and we were sitting there chatting. And, I said, you know what, we ought to do this. We really should do this. And by the end of that evening, the three of us decided that we were going to go on an elk hunt in Wyoming. Now, when we sat there planning, we figured that the cost was going to be about $1,500, $1,200 to $1,500, not only for the license, but just getting out there, the supplies we were going to need. And I knew that in my life, that raising that kind of money was not going to be easy. It was going to take a couple years. So I said, you know what, I really need to plan like 3 years out so that I can do this. So we did, and Dan and Phil were game. We set a date 3 years out, and I did a couple things, like actually made a couple dining room tables and sold them, and some other stuff to get the money for all this. And then Horizon ended up giving me a gift one October for Pastor Appreciation Month. 1 October, a gift of several $100s. So I called Dan and Phil and I said, I think I can do this a year earlier. And they were ready. So we moved it up a year and we decided to go in 2012. Dan and Aaron were married in 2011. So 2012, they were a year married. And we did. And there was all kinds of planning. We used to get together and we would sit down and we would plan. What we planned to do is hike. And I know that this isn't going to make sense to any of you. Most people in Wyoming, they hunt on horses, and it's a much different thing than what we were doing. But we hiked. And that picture that I was holding up, the thumbnail, is a picture of the day that I got that elk. But we hiked, and the preparation, we knew it was going to be brutal, that it was going to be a real brutal physical experience. It's on Lake Pennsylvania. The mountains go straight up. You're at elevation. And any of you who have ever had an opportunity to do any hiking when you're up at 8, 9, 10,000 feet, you know that us East Coasters, they call us the Flatlanders. Those of us from the East Coast, we're not used to that elevation, and it really takes your breath away. So for months ahead of time, I was working on getting in shape. I had a backpack. I bought a 50-pound bag of dog food, and I put it in my backpack, and I would go to the parkway and run up and down the hills in the parkway with the backpack on to get in shape. But really, nothing prepares you for the elevation, the lack of oxygen at elevation. It's still when you're hiking, it kind of takes your breath away. You almost panic because you just can't get air. It's not like climbing a flight of stairs and feeling out of breath. You just can't get oxygen, and it's somewhat panicky the first couple of times that you experience. Anyway, all that to say, we had done all kinds of preparation. We were out there for 2 weeks. We were hiking. It was absolutely brutal physically. I lost so much weight. I actually ran out of holes in my belt by the like the time we were done, I we had all of our clothing because we were hiking. You're really limited in what you can carry. All of our clothing we packed in little bags that fit in our backpacks. My entire 2 weeks of clothing fit in a bag that was not a whole lot bigger than a 2-liter bottle of soda. That's what the clothing that we lived on for a week, or for 2 weeks. I'm sorry. At one point, in fact, after I got my elk, I think I was actually so exhausted physically, I actually was getting sick. Well, I'm not going to go into all that story, but getting sick just from being exhausted and dehydrated. But it was a fantastic experience. And so that, Estella, that is my 2012 elk. But anyway, all that to say, actually, I'm not sure why I'm saying all that, why I'm telling that story, other than the fact that for me, I went into this thinking this is a once in a lifetime experience. This trip was about 2.5 years in the making, a lot of planning, and it was just an incredible experience. Probably the hardest thing I ever did physically. We had a couple of encounters with bears. We hiked all over the mountain. There was one group of mountains, I should say, lots of mountains. There's one group of Wyoming guys. They had their camp set up with horses and mules, and the big canvas tents. And they actually don't think East Coast tents. These are the big canvas tents where they actually have like a wood stove inside the tent, and they have kitchens set up. Anyway, we hiked by them a couple times, and they called us the crazy hikers. They just thought we were insane because we were doing this on foot. But it was absolutely a fantastic experience. And I often thought about being in Barry Rebert's living room decades earlier when I saw that elk, and I thought I would never be able to do that. And here I was doing it. And it was for me this once in a lifetime experience. I thought this was my chance to go out west and to hunt an elk. And here's what's really interesting. I came home from that once in a lifetime experience, and we carried bear spray, of course, out west. And that's another story, our encounters with bears, but we carried bear spray. And I will never forget, right at the end, all three of us got elk. That was the first one. It's a trophy elk. That was the first one. And then Phil got one, and then Dan got one. So all three of us got elk. We had, I have a trailer, and we hauled this trailer out there, and Dan emptied his freezer and put his freezer in the back of the trailer. And Phil got us a little generator. When we got elk, we took them into town and had them butchered. And on the last day, we showed up at the butcher. We had made arrangements with him last day. And from that elk, I came home with about 250 pounds of meat. 250 pounds of meat. So we had, you add that up for three of them. We had a pile of meat. We went to the butcher the last morning. He had it all shrink wrapped and packaged, and we put the meat in the freezer, turned the generator on, and we started driving home. And it was quite an experience. But here's the thing I wanted to head towards telling you this story about this elk. And I'm obviously avoiding all the gory details about the actual hunt. But it was one of the last days we were in Wyoming. I think we had 2 days left. And Yeah, I agree. Elk meat is actually, honestly, Donna prefers elk meat to anything else. Um, it's really good meat. For those of you who are meat eaters, elk meat is really good. Anyway, so we were sitting on a hillside. We had, I think, one day left in Wyoming. We stank really badly after hiking for 2 weeks with, you're just interchanging clothing all the time. We stank really badly. Actually, we were very anxious to come home and see our families. We'd been out in the wilderness for 2 weeks. But I looked at my can of bear spray, and this was in 2012. My can of bear spray expired in 2015. And I remember saying to Dan and Phil, I said, you know what, guys, this bear spray is good until 2015. Why don't we plan to come back 3 years from now in 2015? And they all agreed. Dan and Phil both agreed. So we came home and talked to our spouses, and we said, hey, can we go back in 2015? What's really interesting is, again, when you rewind the clock, I guess for me, you rewind the clock, years or decades earlier, I stood in a living room, looked at a friend of mine who had gotten an elk, and I thought, I'll never, ever in my life do that. And I wasn't sad about that. I just didn't think it was reality. And in 2012, I got to do it. It was fantastic. And here we were in 2012 planning to do it again in 2015. What's really interesting is some of you, I know that a few of you know this story, but later that year, actually early 2013, Dan and Aaron sat down in our living room, and they said, you know what, we really want to give Wyoming a try. So they moved out to Wyoming. We helped them move out in 2013, and Dan and Aaron live out there now. And I get to go out to Wyoming several times a year. I've hunted out there multiple times. I'm going to be, well, if all goes well, I'm going to be going out again in September, not to hunt, but just to help Dan with some hunts. And I'll probably go out again. I've hunted elk several times out there, hunted mule deer. I've hiked a lot. And something that I never, ever thought was going to happen has now become a regular part of my life. In fact, when Donna came home, she works for an attorney in Emmaus, and one of her clients, a gentleman that goes out regularly to hunt elk, somehow he knew in 2012 that I was going out. And he kind of followed my journey through Donna. And he knew that I said it was a once in a lifetime experience. So when I came home, he was asking Donna about the trip, and Donna was showing him some pictures. And Donna said, yeah, it was really a fantastic trip. It was a once in a lifetime experience. And he looked at Donna and he said, so when's he going again? And Donna laughed and she said, in 2015. So I didn't even have to wait till 2015. I got to go out in 2013 and have been out multiple times since. All that to say, it was a fun elk story, and it was something, again, for me, I never, ever thought I would get to do. All that to say that I think for a lot of us, it's really hard to know what our future holds, isn't it? Our future really is unpredictable. Somebody once told me that we overestimate what we can do in a short period of time, but we underestimate what we can do in a long period of time. And I found that to be so true in my life, that sometimes my list of things to do in a day, I can't get to everything. But when I look at what gets accomplished over a long period of time, thinking back to that experience at Hope's Outdoorsman's Banquet, back in probably 2009 or 2010, when the three of us said we should do this someday. And not only have we done it once, but we've done it a half dozen times. And it really is that sense of we underestimate what we're able to do in a long period of time. Also, this sometimes gets me thinking about heaven, this sense that for me, we sometimes, when I think about my future, the fact that I can't predict my future and I don't know what my future holds, that I think heaven is in essence the same way. It's the same in some way, that it's really hard to predict how good heaven's going to be, and it's hard for us to understand the goodness of God, that this future that we have is really kind of beyond reckoning. When I thought about my future, hunting, for example, in Wyoming, I thought that I knew what my future held when I was a young pastor. I just thought, I can see it. It's all kind of planned out. Never imagining, never understanding all that my future held. And the same, I think, is true of heaven. It's hard for us to imagine what our future holds. So anyway, I can't believe I talk as much as I do. I look at the time that goes by. That's the story of my elk. That's the story of my elk. And for me, it was a wonderful lesson in kind of how we underestimate what is possible for us in the future. And I've gotten to do things I never, ever thought that I would be able to do. And I think the same is true of heaven, that we'll get to do things that we never, ever thought were possible. But God really has good in store for us. So thanks for listening to my elk story. And thanks for asking, Estella. And how about if I pray? God, thank you for your faithfulness to us. God, I thank you that you do have an incredible future in store for us. I think sometimes it's hard for us to trust you with our futures. And God, I also know that here in this lifetime, that our future sometimes has in store difficulties as well. In fact, there's no doubt that there are difficulties in store. But God, I thank you that the future that we hold on to with you is a future that is beyond our imaginings, better than we ever thought possible. God, I thank you for how good you've been to me, how much I've gotten to enjoy in this lifetime. Thank you, God, for how good you've been to all of us, to everybody who's listening. Even in some of the worst circumstances, God, you still are good and faithful. Thank you for that. Thank you, God, that we have a day ahead of us and that we can go through this day in your presence. I pray, God, that we'd be reminded of your presence in what we do today. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All righty, everybody. Well, thank you all, and hope you have a great day.